Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and basically we're continuing on with our dive into Express and Express React views. Less about React today, more just about other things you want to consider when you're working with Express in general. Today we're going to be talking about .env files. And basically what the concept here is that sometimes there's information you want to kind of hide, like API keys, certain secret information that if you just left in your code and you pushed it to GitHub, everyone would see it, and that wouldn't necessarily be very good because it would tell them how to like decrypt passwords or access your API key and write up, basically leave you with a huge bill because they make all these API calls. So the way you hide the information is that you create a place where variables are stored and can only be accessed in particular environments. That's why they're called environment variables. So those variables have to be defined everywhere you have your code. So generally this does not get pushed up to GitHub. How do you prevent something from being pushed to GitHub? What you do is that in the folder for your project, in the root, you're going to put in a file called .gitignore. What this means is that Git will ignore any files you specify in here. Now when working with Node, there's two things I always ignore. .env files, because the whole purpose of .env files is that they don't get pushed up to GitHub, and the Node modules folder, because people can just install everything based on your package.json when they download your code. Okay? So you always want to put those two in your Node modules, in your .env file, .ignore file. Okay, cool. So now we know that those two things will be ignored whenever we try to push to Git. The other file, again, I said we're talking about, is a .env file. This is going to be variables that we want to separate from our code. We don't want it in our code. We don't want to push these variables up to GitHub because we don't want people seeing what these variables are. Later on, when we deploy to Heroku, you will put those environmental variables in a special area on Heroku where they can't, where it achieves the same result. Okie dokie, so let's see here. In that, to use this .env file, we do need to actually install the library. So let's actually open up this folder, our project folder, in terminal. And from there, I want to install the package npm install .dotenv. That's the package. So that's installing. So that'll take a second. Meanwhile, let's actually put some variables in here. So I'll put some basic variables in here. We're going to put, like, right now we have our port number. So if I go to server.js and I just go down to our listener at the very bottom of the code right here, see I say app.listen and I specify 3000. That's a hard-coded number. Now if I'm going to deploy the Heroku later, I don't necessarily want that. I want that in an environmental variable. So usually you're going to have a variable called port, and Heroku will by default have a variable called port. So we don't need to worry about Heroku's version of the variable. We need to worry about our version here locally when we're running the code on our computer. So we're going to go over here and just say ours is 3000. Okie dokie. And I need to make sure that that .env package is being used. So we don't need to store it in a variable. We just need to actually just invoke it. So require .env, and then we just, I think, have to run this config function, and then that should be it. Now the reason why there's this config function is because there's actually a bunch of options you can config, as far as like you can actually have multiple .env files and other things you can configure, but by default it'll just look for a file called .env. meaning environmental variables. So if you put that, now it knows to go look for variables in there. And now I want to configure my port number. So I'll say const, I'll create a variable, well, we'll say const port equals process dot env. Now process.env always just means environmental variables. So it's going to look inside, look for an environmental variable in your .env file, and then I chain off that object, which will be port, the one that we specified inside of our .env. Okay, so again, this is the object with all my environmental variables, and here I chain off of it and grab that variable, and then I can go back down here and just change this to port. Okay, and then instead of this being listening to port 3000, I can say listening to port, and then use my variable to, so that way no matter what the number changes to, it's port. Okay, and just to actually show you how that changes, I want to actually change the port number to something other than 3000. So say 3001. So now I enable my .env file, I grab a variable from it, and I will use that to determine my port. And this you have to do if you're going to do Heroku, because it's going to look for, it's going to give, Heroku is going to assign its own port number, and so it's going to look for this variable, and if it doesn't use this to determine what the port is, it will not be able to find the port that Heroku assigns it. So that's another reason why environmental variables are really useful, because it allows you to define something on your local environment, but then allow other environments to define it for themselves. Cool. So let's actually run that so you can see that at work. So let's say nodamon server.js. You can see it's listening to port 3001, so it works. So now if I go over here, we'll go to local host 3001.